Today, we're here to talk a little bit about product activation. It's actually one of my favorite topics to talk about. One of our earliest programs, the second program we ever created for Reforge, was our retention and engagement program, which I wrote myself with Casey Winters and Sean Clowes. And so it's kind of stuck with me for many, many years. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about through a case study that Lauren team went through at Amplitude, just talking about one of these key moments where you need to kind of revamp, product activation, the lessons learned, and all the results from that. Throughout this time, feel free to chat, but if you have a question for Laura or I, can you just use the Q&A feature? It should be at the bottom of your Zoom. You can enter it in, and if everybody else wants to open up that Q&A and upvote the questions that they're most interested in, that'll give us some good signal of where to focus in on. I'm going to give about a 5 or maybe 10-minute intro max, and then Laura's going to go through about 20 minutes of the case of what they did at Amplitude to increase activation over 2.5x. And then we're going to use the rest of the time for questions to kind of dive deep, tell examples, stories, and where you all want to go. So once again, just go ahead and use that Q&A feature at the bottom along the way. For others, feel free to upvote along the way. I'm Brian. I'm founder and CEO of Reforge. Prior to that, I was VP of Growth at HubSpot, helping on the CRM and the sales products. Though that feels like way long ago now. It's almost a decade old now, which is kind of crazy to think about. And today, my guest is Laura Schaffer. She's VP of Growth at DigitalOcean. She was most recently at Amplitude, leading a bunch of product growth efforts there. And she's going to tell a whole host of stories and examples, from that time today. Laura, do you just want to chime in and say hi and welcome before I dive into my section?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey guys, so happy to be here. So as Brian mentioned, I am going to primarily be talking about Amplitude today, which I'm so excited about. I've been in growth generally for over this point a crazy long time, since before growth was a thing. Back in 2011, 2012 was I think when I started doing this crazy stuff. So but my chapter at Amplitude is one of my absolute favorites, layering in a self-serve motion into more of a sales-led organization. So we're going to be talking about how we moved activation in the context of that environment, which I'm guessing several of you are in today. So definitely want this to be very actionable for y'all, and really excited for the Q&A as well.
Awesome. All right, well, let's just set up the case study and the story. If you're all here, you're probably working on activation in some way. And the way that we really think about it at Reforge is that activation is this bridge between marketing and product. It's how do you take your user from that sign up to establishing a habit? That's really key, establishing a habit around your core value prop. One of the biggest mistakes I see is these people who work on activation don't actually take somebody all the way to the habit. They're actually just taking somebody through the setup experience, but that's not far enough. The goal of activation is how do you really provide this bridge to establishing that habit into the core product. And the reason it's most critical is just activation touches every single user that signs up to your product, 100% of the users. And that's not the same for the other funnels and touch points of your product. But most importantly, in like today's really competitive environment where almost every product has a dozen different competitors, your first impression ends up being the last impression to the users. It's actually very, very difficult to win the user back if they don't have a good activation experience. And so one of the things that, we commonly think about is just like, why is user onboarding this never-ending problem that you kind of have to work on in an organization versus this one-time project that you touch and then don't come back to, until 6 or years later. And this is really explained by this concept that Bengali Kaba, who worked on growth at Instagram and was in the EIR for us at Reforge for a while and is now at YouTube. He calls it the adjacent user theory, right? And so all products that we start with, we start by targeting a very specific ideal user. But then to keep growing, we need to keep expanding that ideal user definition to the next adjacent circle, to the next adjacent circle. And so it kind of looks like this bullseye target or these layers of concentric circles. And in order to keep doing that, we have to change a bunch of things. We have to evolve our target customer or persona. We have to maybe layer on new go-to-market motions, which I think Laura will talk about, like moving from sales-led to product-led. We sometimes have to change our marketing channel to access these next set of users, or we have to change our product. We have to add features, we have to add whole products, we have to add different value props to appeal to this next layer and this next layer. And as we make all of these changes, it has all of these crazy second order effects that are hard to account for. It changes the intent of the user that the users are coming in with, the language that resonates with the user, right? Like the language that resonates with the early adopters, your first users, is very different than the late adopters. It changes the context that the user's coming in with, the features and the value props that resonate the most with the users that you're targeting at that stage. And so it changes all sorts of these different things. And as a result, that really changes this bridge, this activation funnel, this journey from how you go from marketing, that sign up to establishing that core value prop. And so you have to constantly keep working and changing your activation funnel with these evolutions. And of course, so what happens a lot of these times? Well, unfortunately, one of the things that happens is as we add all these things, these new marketing channels, these new features, all that kind of stuff, we end up adding all of these different journeys, these pop-ups, whatever, into the product to try to accommodate for all of these changes and all of these evolutions. And my guess is you have all had that experience where you sign up for a new product and it's just like pop-up overload and you're like, what the hell is going on here? And it just ends up being overwhelming and directing people in a million different directions, and that actually hurts on activation. And so it sets up this, what I call this paradox, where to keep expanding, to keep growing, we have to keep adding and evolving things. But when it comes to activation, if we just keep adding things to it, it just becomes overwhelming, and you hit this point where there's this giant disconnect with your onboarding experience and kind of the current state of affairs, like where your audience is, who you're targeting, and what that experience needs to be. And so I've also been there's these moments in a company, no matter what you do. Ideally, we all have a team dedicated to user onboarding, constantly keeping up with it. But look, in reality, we have so many different priorities and things that we need to tackle and limited resources in a team. And so there's always these moments, these kind of reset moments where you have to take a step back and you have to say, look, all these things have changed. We kind of need to reset, reground, and okay, who is our ideal target user today? What are the new motions, the value props that resonate most with them? And instead of just like adding a bunch of things to the experience, it's like, how do we simplify this experience or really target in this experience to where we're at today in this giant evolution? And that's what Laura's going to talk about with an experience with Amplitude and her story of how they more than doubled activation in one of these key moments, in one of these key evolutions. And so I will let Laura take it from here to tell us that story.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, great overview of activation. This second half, we're really going to be getting into the tactical part of activation. So what did we do at Amplitude to execute? And hopefully, again, you guys can walk away with some things that you can put into practice. So just to get us all on the same page first, for those of you not familiar with Amplitude, Amplitude offers digital analytics. Okay, what does that mean? It means that it helps you understand how users are engaging with your product and your products. You can see what they're clicking on, which products they're using, all of those things. They often form the leading indicators towards your kind of growth output metrics. So things like activation typically can be measured here. Now, interestingly, about a couple of years ago, Amplitude started to introduce other things than digital analytics, which is what they're primarily known for. So you can also now do session replay, right? So you can watch users live in product, which is really insightful. You can actually run A/B tests on users so that you can run the test and then see data all in the same ecosystem, and then CDP functionality to get data in and out. So definitely a platform play, which is going to be relevant to some of the stuff we're talking through later. All right, so that's Amplitude. Now, where Amplitude is today. So Amplitude has around, yeah, exactly, a 26.5% activation rate, which is pretty darn good. There's definitely room for growth there, but not bad. Then platform-based free plan. So all that juicy platform stuff I just mentioned is all available on the free plan, which is great because it helps show the value of Amplitude early, which is good for all kinds of growth-related things. And then, of course, we've got a generally available self-serve plan, which is a paid self-serve plan, which is called Plus. You can get a little bit more of all that stuff. And generally that business, that self-serve paid motion is accelerating quarter over quarter, which we love. And it's become an underpinning of Amplitude's overall business. But go to the next slide. It's definitely not where we were in early 2023. And so we're going to talk about here how we got there, in particular, how activation helped us do it. So we had executive buying, which is amazing. That's a really hard thing to do. And it was something that the previous folks who were previously doing growth really built up for us, which was great momentum to have. But we still had a lot to do, right? We did not have that generally available plan. So that whole plus plan didn't exist. The free plan didn't have access to the platform. So it was just showcasing a piece of what Amplitude did. There are a lot of different opinions and perspectives about how we should approach doing this, which is very normal, right? There's always a lot of different ways to do it. So that makes sense. And then of course, activation was at 10%, which is really not so great. So that's where we were. So let's go to the next slide. Now there's a few things, right? You can imagine, I'm sure you're thinking a bunch of things, how to get done in order for us to get this motion out. I'm not going to read through all of them, but I want to ask you, of all these things you see here, which one do you think was the thing that if we didn't increase it, didn't improve it, didn't check the box on it, that would actually have barred launch? If you go to the next slide, probably have some guesses based on the title of this presentation, but it was activation. That was actually the thing we had a target that we needed to get to in order for us to launch our self-serve plan. So with all the other work going on, that still would have stopped it. And let's talk about why. So let's first just think about, got to pull the Olympics in somehow. So this is how I think about monetization. You're getting someone to buy something self-serve. It's like a bar, right? And it's friction. Just like anything else, payment is friction. And you got to get someone up over that friction in order for them to actually give you money. And we get them over that friction with value. And if you convey enough value, perceived or realized, then they will get over that bar and pay you. And if you don't, they hit the bar, they go under the bar, whatever the heck they do, right? And activation is the very first marker of value, very first one. If they're not hitting that, they're surely not going to get over the bar. So it's something that we really needed to improve in order to get this out. And again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, people who activate, they tend to be more likely to buy. It's experimentation friendly because it happens early on. So it's very actionable. It's, of course, for people who don't buy right away, it's that foundation of your retained users, which you can monetize later. And of course, those learnings from that quick iteration early on help inform how you can retain them later in many ways. So let's go on. So that's why it was so important. So again, summary, plan of attack. We wanted to get activation up to 16% at least in order for us to launch. That was the bar. Little sneak peek there. We did get there. Spoiler alert. You can see that chart. But the other part was we wanted to bring the platform into the plans. We're going to be talking about the things to the left today.
I just wanted to pause here for a moment. And
yeah.
This graph on the left, I think, is really important, which it starts to indicate like this didn't happen from one major launch. Like we're not seeing a step function here. We're seeing this nice gradual increase over time, and I'm sure you'll like talk a little bit about that. But I often see like a lot of teams being like, oh, all we need to do is this one thing, and we're going to double our activation rate. And it sounds like you can already tell from this graph there were multiple efforts that went into this. So I think this is just a great example of that.
Totally. And lots of failure in there, which we'll also talk about later. It's one of my favorite topics. All right. So what did we actually do to drive this? Let's go to the next slide. There were 3 key themes that really helped us succeed here. One is focus, saying no to a lot of stuff. It's really easy to peanut butter and growth because there's so many things you can do. Going focus in depth works a lot better than broad and shallow. We'll talk more about that. Prescription. People tend to enter products and for the first time and sign up for the first time in a state of overwhelm. So you have to be ruthlessly prioritizing what you show them, especially early on, prescriptive about what they're seeing and what they should do early on. Setup. Amplitude has a relatively complex setup. There's some technical elements to it. You got to get data in. So that was also a big lever for us. Not always the sexiest part of activation and getting people to activate, but a critical one. And if you've got an interesting setup like we do at Amplitude, that's probably going to be a lever for you as well. So let's go a little bit deeper. So again, focus critical. Let's go to the next slide. So 2 reasons why focus is so critical in moving a metric meaningfully. One is, again, there's so many levers in growth. These are just some of them across acquisition, monetization, retention. I've seen teams really struggle to move a activation because they're trying to do so many things at one time. And especially if your team is just getting off the ground with self-serve, or if your team isn't massive, this is a really clear, very important thing to do in order to move the metric, to sequence how you're going to approach the funnel. All right, flip to the next. This is my favorite, one of my favorite stats in all growth, which is around 80% of experiments fail. This is the other reason why it's critical to focus, because the team needs capacity and time to actually run experiments, have them fail, and nudge them in the right direction. If you're running a smattering of experiments across many different areas, a lot of them are going to fail and none of them are going to move. So again, that fun quote from Ronnie down below, I won't read that, but skim it. It's one of my favorites, which is, again, just, it seems like this is crazy high. Well, maybe the people just aren't smart. We're not doing it right. Nope. Every company that does this, it's quite high. Netflix is actually as high as 90%. These are great companies that do well. It's still quite high. So focus in depth, not shallow and broad. All right. And what happens when you do that? Well, the team has time to investigate, to go deep, to research, to use some user testing, to talk to customers, to look at the data to see where you maybe should be prescriptive, and find wins, which then allow you to have the capacity to fail, to learn, to optimize, to grow. Right.
And
Yeah.
and I know you're going to go into very specific examples here of what you all did, but I keep seeing the question kind of come up, which I think will be good context for the rest of this, which is, how did you all define innovation at Amplitude? And maybe you're going to talk about that evolution. If so, just say we're going to get to that. But I've seen that question pop up a few times, so I just wanted to insert that before we get into the specific examples.
A very good question. Thank you guys for asking that. So for Amplitude, right, predominantly users are starting out with our analytics function. So we view activation for analytics or data as first chart save. We did evolve it recently, very recently, actually. We've evolved it to effectively include a few other things. But during this time we're talking about was first chart save, and we found that to be really indicative. If someone could save a chart, it meant they'd found something that was worth keeping, and it was a really good indicator of user aha, as well as, again, indicative of retention and actually payment behavior. So when we were talking about activation in the context of Amplitude, we're talking about first chart save primarily. There are some other ways you could activate, like, so I mentioned this other platform plays, so we started to add in first usage of those, but for the bulk of this journey, those were still new. So really, first chart save was what it anchored on. Again, why is that important? Because when we saw users use the product, we could see when they saved. That was a moment of like, yes, found something. And then again, the data side, it had good propensity towards habit and even towards payment behavior.
I'd also add, just as a very active user of Amplitude, when you save something, it automatically gets you into this habit, in this loop of getting updates about that chart. And so it's like entering you into this habit loop of, getting into this habit of consistently checking specific metrics and staying up to date, which of course draws you in and then gets you to do other things like at the same time. And that's just a behavior I've noticed on my end as well. All right, prescription. Tell me about this, Laura. What did you all do here?
All right. So before we even talk about the product, let's talk about the user, because this is something that's to be consistent across just about everybody here. It's really easy in growth when we're looking at onboarding every day and using our product every day, or thinking about our product every day, to project that on our users and imagine that they're excited also when they're getting started. Unfortunately, that's often not where their headspace is at. Stuff like this usually, which is, I wonder if this is going to solve my problem. They're thinking about, they only have 10, 12 minutes. Very rarely do people just set aside a day to like get to know a product. It's usually like between meetings. Oh, this one ended earlier. Let me check out that thing that I've been meaning to check out. They're wondering if they're in the right place. Should they be like Googling this instead versus actually going through your flow? Do I have the expertise? Should I have somebody else look at this? Do I have the right tools to make this work? Right. All of this stuff tends to be the actual headspace that people are in when they're signing up for the first time. So one thing I want you to think about is my current onboarding experience conducive to someone in this headspace? And the answer is probably no. And that's where a lot of opportunity is to grow activation. So let's go to the next slide. So certainly Amplitude was not delivering well against people in that headspace. So this is an early iteration of what onboarding actually looked like. So you can see there's over 20 things to click on. That's not good. There's so many ways for somebody to get lost. Again, just state of overwhelm. There's an unnecessary high number of steps. There's 5, but it's kind of truncated it that way. It wasn't super logical. And it seems like a lot with someone coming in. The Save Chart experience was focused on creating one from scratch, which just felt really overwhelming to people. And then after the guide, they landed a homepage that had the actual exact same format and like content as enterprise customers. So again, just overly complex all through and through. We're not being prescriptive enough about what we want them to do and what we want them to see. So first, before I get into some of the cool stuff we did, I want to say there's often very uncool stuff that can move the needle a lot. So just removing those gems at the top moved activation up over 5%. That's it. Like the cool part about that's the impact, not removing gems being a creative endeavor, right? So we did an exercise where we Mary Kondoed our onboarding experience. We literally went through as a team. We're like, what doesn't spark joy for someone in here? And we just like X'd out stuff and crossed out things, and it actually fueled some of this great kind of reduction of stuff that increased activation. And this was one of the most impactful and simplest. I wanted to raise this, but often less is more. Remove stuff. Templates, big. So it can be really easy for companies to think that, hey, if we are, if we're going with templates, like maybe we're belittling the amazing things we can do. There's such great advanced features that Amplitude offers, cohort views and journey stuff, all this stuff, predictive analysis. And so there's an energy of like, let's like expose people to that. But really out the gate, again, state of overwhelm, needing to get to first value, things like templates are incredibly, incredibly powerful. And so it drove a ton of activation. But the other thing that stuff like templates can do is get them in the habit of finding a center and being in a center where they can create more stuff. So in addition to this increasing activation, it also, flip to the next slide, helped with retention. So as Brian was noting around like, hey, chart saves get people in the zone and want to stick around. Templates in particular was super sticky. People were engaging. And then it also informed our homepage. So that's our homepage there on the right. And so one of the great things that iterating fast and activation can do is help paint the way to how you keep them after they've activated. So this is a great win for us in terms of activation up front, but then it also like just a drum beat of keeping someone happy in our product, especially when they're new and getting their sea legs. So then fewer steps. That was the last thing I mentioned, just getting down to fewer steps. This is actually a little bit of a hint of what we're going to talk about later with setup. But that looks a lot less daunting than the 5-step one before, right? So again, these things are, there's so many more things that we could potentially do there. But again, just simplification, prescription, helping people not feel overwhelmed.
It's funny, my gut reaction to this one, and the reason I'm laughing a little bit is like, obviously when you put them side by side, the long list and the short list, you're like, oh my God, yeah, this feels way less overwhelming. But I think a lot of times our temptation is to fill empty space. Right, in the UI. So it's like, oh, like what other steps can I put here, right? And that's actually is like very counter to to this feeling of just like, oh, okay, I only have to do these 2 things and I'm gonna get some value. So anyways, that was my reaction when I first saw this, and I know others kind of go through that as well. So
I love
okay,
that.
second one.
Yeah, ugly. Don't be afraid of ugly things or lots of just open space and fewer things to do. Often those things test really well. Some point we'll have to do a webinar on ugly things that test well because it's a lot. All right. So setup. So don't underestimate your setup, especially if your setup is a little bit more complex like Amplitude. But even if it's not, like setup is friction too, and it's really can be really challenging if you have a grueling setup experience, then have the momentum to continue to go and activate. So don't discount it. So again, setup. Where were we, right? All right. So there's clearly a perception of complexity here. It's unclear which is best. It's like, here's a bunch of ways to get in data. And people are like, what if I screw this up? And we didn't help them at all, right? Here's an API key. Okay, what do I do with that? Not clear. So again, then multiple steps still is there. And then actually encourages users to leave, right? A view all, like that's almost the most clear CTA in this page is like view all. If you're not confident in clicking on a tile, that's what you're going to do, which takes you out of this entirely. So again, lots of things that did not make this conducive to someone in a state of overwhelm. All right, and then what did we do? So again, because we had focus and the team was able to pay attention to this, they did some good digging into, okay, what are the popular data sources? What are the popular data sources? What tends to be effective for folks getting started? And experimented a lot with that, like different tiles and organization to see what was best. But then the other thing we're able to look at, right, is how did someone's data source impact not just activation, but retention? So how could we put forth the right data sources that were going to drive activation in a way that was going to be conducive towards habit and towards a retained customer? And so that was a big part of what we did and why the tiles are what they are now. And of course, lots of failure and A/B testing to figure out the right mix. And
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding this one real quick. So on the left, it's like just give an example for a data source for those that
yeah.
aren't familiar with the
Yeah, let
product.
me give, so like, let's give like kind of polarizing different ones. So one would be like, one way to get data in is like upload a CSV. Let's just upload a hard list of like events. And another one might be actually implementing our SDK. So taking our snippet and adding it to your website. So if you think about that, right, it may be that getting like a first data, like that first data in that sheet is going to get someone set up really easily, but it did, but it tended to not retain. And so we thought about that in the context of which ones we were surfacing, right? So not just looking solely at activation, but looking at the pair together.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so like the blue line here, right, is saying, oh man, tons of people on the left-hand side is saying tons of people are clicking this thing, right? And if you're just looking at that data, it's like, okay, well, maybe we should emphasize that. But if you look at the right, the people who kind of use that data source on the blue line, they actually retain the worst. And so that it, if those two are actually corresponding, I know we don't have labels here, that the actual right decision here is to look at the sources that, one method would be to look at the sources that are retaining the highest, right, and see if we can emphasize, simplify like those, right, to get more people on those versus emphasize the lowest retaining ones. And I think that actually goes back to your templates one too. I've heard this from like folks at like Airtable and stuff who, they have crazy amounts of your eyes contractor used to talk about this, where they used to look at this similar type of data for templates to see which templates created the highest retention and figured out how to emphasize those versus versus just like the quote unquote most popular ones as well. So I think that research can apply in a couple different places.
Totally. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's helpful, right? Part of the reason I like to highlight that one is that, you want to think about activation not in a silo. You want to be thinking about how it impacts downstream, because as you iterate on activation, you can change up some of that as well. So it's something we definitely paid attention to. It's always great to A/B test and have activation be your North Star, but keep an eye on retention because it's just a critical part of the two. And that was a good example. Yeah, I think that actually might have been getting data in with the CSV download, that blue line. So now where are we with data setup? So just a few things I want to highlight here. So one, a very clear assertion of recommendation. This is what we recommend, right? Action oriented, clear. Paste this snippet into the head of every page of your website. Much more obvious what's going on there. Again, we went from multiple steps to one. So instead of having a step where you implement and then a step where you listen, and then we give you more context, literally just snippet and a listen all right here. And then again, popular data sources, these are carefully curated. There's additional plans to learn more about a user so we can curate certain things. We can understand their stack a little bit. So there's even more that this can be pushed, but this tested extremely well. And if you look down at the bottom, it's that CSV crumb. That's all at the bottom, right? Because we know that doesn't test as well. So unless someone's kind of hungry for it, we want them to do the things at the top. So what did this increase? Over 33% increase in data setup, right? And there were so many more iterations of this that we did, and so much more that this generated. But even just some of these changes here was a really powerful outlay. And again, team was able to run tons of experiments and tons of tests to get to the right tinker and get to the right place. This was definitely a big driver under the hood of our activation impact. All right. So what was the impact of focus, being prescriptive, and driving setup and focusing on that piece of it? Well, activation moved from that 10% we saw in the beginning all the way up to 26.5% as the most recent high. And it also fueled even more ideas about we could go further. So the team's got a very active backlog that we feel really confident in large part because we've been following this very careful approach where we've been learning and then iterating over time. So we've got a lot of, not only do we have the existing data, the metric milestone that we're at, we have the momentum to move it further. And that was very linked to and connected to our free to paid conversion rate, right? Because again, we go back to that high bar and people having enough value to go up over the bar. Activation and getting that number up was a huge part of seeing people actually succeed and convert and pay, which was then really driven and a connector to that quarter a self-serve paid acceleration that we saw, which is that graph there on the right. So very critical part of our prereq to our launch, and a very important part of our ongoing success in this area. So that concludes kind of the tactical part. We obviously have plenty of time here for Q&A. And I know already there's a bunch of questions that have been asked, including one of my personal favorites that I saw in here, which I'm going to sneak up, which is, hey, like, how terrified were you guys when activation dropped after launch? Like, did y'all just all, set yourselves on fire and run around screaming in the office? So the answer is, always a little bit, right, when it drops. But part of what helped us have a little bit more of a sense of what was going on there was the fact that we, at that launch, when we were doing that kind of this big plug, we were getting to a lot of kind of explorers, like people coming into our sign up flow, just kind of investigating. And obviously when you get sign up spikes, and actually you can kind of see a few of them in that mix where you see like a big drop. It's usually not because you did something terrible with activation that can happen. It's often, and certainly was in our case, we were experimenting a lot with signups, and then that changes your, you make big changes to your denominator. It impacts your overall conversion rate. And so that was a big part of why it dipped immediately after. But one of the things that helps, again, keep kind of steady and keep everyone oriented on the right thing when there are drops, and or to know if there's actually a problem, is to look at activated count, right? So conversion rate's a great thing to target and focus on, but it is a little bit at the mercy of jumps in signup. So when you are doing a big launch, or the team's experimenting with different ways of getting new eyeballs in, what you really want to pay attention to make sure that you're on the right track and that things are going to normalize with conversion rate is your activated count. And as long as that's growing and moving up, you're making the right play. And actually we can, if folks are interested, we can talk about how we did graduate into leveraging sign up to grow our activated count, which then did put some pressure on our activation conversion. That's been something we've been recently looking at and how we manage that. Yeah, great question.
So I definitely want to get into the audience Q&A. I'm going to keep the slides up in case we want to refer back to them from the moment. But before I get to audience Q&A, you talked a little bit about failed experiments at the end. And I love asking this question. It's like, what experiment or thing that you tried, like before you tried it, you were like, I'm pretty damn sure this is going to work. And it just didn't work. I love hearing those stories because it's just like, it's a good reminder that our intuition isn't always the best.
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, that 80% failure rate, we could spend the rest of the time talking about things that failed, big and small. So lots of small things failed. I'm going to service that first, and then I'm going to talk about a big one that was fun. And I want to highlight that just because that happens so often, and those are often often unsung. We had lots of tests that didn't meet the mark with those tiles, like putting the right ones on, and even just our there was like a piece of work that we did to allow someone to put in just implement one snippet and then automatically get access not just to data but like session replay and the other parts of the platform. So many experiments to get that right, not like freak people out, like make sure they understood that it was actually going to give them like good value to things but still offering privacy. So like an opt out if they wanted, but so many just iterations of that was like the biggest source of failure, was like the lead up to the success. So just want to note that. But in terms of things that I was like super bullish on, the team was bullish on, that wasn't effective. I had a hypothesis that that one of the things that we needed to do in order to drive activation, this is pretty early on, was we needed to give people like into the product to see just how it worked, even with just demo data or kind of fake data or some kind of data, to kind of earn the time of the developer to go like implement, do the work to implement the snippet and get the like kind of quote unquote real data in. And often like a lot of our signups were non-developer, non-technical personas. So actually not the person who were doing the setup. And so we had this belief or hypothesis that, hey, look, like, let's just like kind of do a dual path where someone can get data in via like CSV or some other means, And then once they're in, like, oh, this is so cool. Look at all these graphs. Okay, now I want my like real data in it. That then they could go tag a developer and be like, hey, I really crazy want this. Can you come in and implement? Versus right, the alternative, which is where like, hey, basically until that developer does that, you're kind of like, you can't really see much. There's not, it's kind of null states everywhere. We believed with high conviction that first one was going to be the better one. Like, who wants to kind of sit in null state? But that didn't work. None of that stuff worked. And in fact, just gave people a false impression that like, oh, this is just how it is. And so like just this, whatever, this kind of demo or fake data, and it didn't give the aha, like not seeing, like not being able to see their actual data in just wasn't strong enough. And so we shifted gears there and we focused on, hey, like, let's just simplify that data setup so that it's so easy for a developer to implement that person's not sitting in that null state for long. And that ended up being the way to go. So definitely was one of those like, full steam head in one direction, like, oh, okay, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Let's hit it and go somewhere else.
I think that's a good reminder. Like what we're always balancing here is the work and the reward the user gets for the work, right? And it sounds like in that case, you were like, hey, I'm trying to decrease the work here for this non-technical user, right? By not right, but and yes, that's true, but the reward just wasn't big enough, as a result. And so it's always a balance of those two things. And you can simplify the work, but if the reward isn't big enough, you're gonna have the same result, which is not no improvement.
Yeah. And the key there, right, is just again being humble about it all and just recognizing that most of your ideas, even the ones you have highest conviction, are probably going to have something wrong with them out the gate. And so what was effective about that was how quickly we shifted off of it when we saw it wasn't effective, right? And when you go into an experiment, especially like, something that's a bigger change, you want to be clear on how you validate the experience, but also how you invalidate it. And so that was helpful. And again, looking at retention data was a really good clue that something was off about that. Definitely part and parcel, and help point us in the right direction. So we credit failures like that with helping solidify the right path. That happening really made it clear that we needed to focus on the SDK. And so we then felt a lot better about the deep work that we were doing to simplify that experience. And if we hadn't had that failure, then we wouldn't have known that was an area to double down. So when we talk about failures, always, we talk about how those failures are inherent and core part of the successes that we have. So that failure is a big part of what drove success in setup.
Okay, we got to get to the top question here because it's so relevant for Amplitude, which is how does that activation work in a case of SaaS software that offers many different features? Mm-hmm. And Amplitude is an incredibly deep product for those that don't know. Like there are tons of features, and this is the exact problem that I think we talked about at the beginning, which is just over time we add more and more features, and we commonly think is like, oh my God, how do I activate a user on all these features, like out of the gate? But that's not actually how to approach activation with a product with lots of features. So anyways, like how did you think about that with Amplitude?
Yeah. So what I really like doing here is making sure that for every core use case, it's usually core product that you have, to make sure that you have an understanding of the funnel leading into that. So there should be an activation measure or definition that maps to each of those things. And then when you measure activation holistically, you're recognizing that people can reach aha in different ways depending on what it is they want to do. So that's first just framework. And then from there, very, very, very often there's sort of one predominant thing that your company is either known for or is the easiest or whatever that people tend to use first. But you've got opportunities then in two different directions. So one is you can think, okay, look, let's just get people, their mindsets on that easy thing or what we're known for, whatever. This is a case of Amplitude. Let's just get them in and activated in data analytics. But then let's see how we can get them activated on other products now that they're sort of in and bought in and have momentum. So that's one way that you can leverage that. And the other is you can take a look at, okay, hey, look, where are we seeing not many people activate? Like, is that because we just don't have people coming in who are interested or have that use case, in which case it might inform like an acquisition strategy? How do we go deeper? Session replay is a good example for that for Amplitude. That's a relatively new product line. But it's relatively straightforward to use once you've got that snippet implemented. And people love it when they use it. People love to watch users in their product and learn from it. So then that other angle can be, okay, which of the things on the list, is there an opportunity for us to drive more activation and grow that up? But it starts with, so what does it mean? So typically, right, you have kind of multiple ways people can hit aha, and then you kind of view it in aggregate. And that becomes a foundation of a nudge for you in terms of like how you can think strategically. Do we grow kind of our bread and butter? Do we branch out? And often it can be a means of thinking of acquisition in conjunction with how people can easily activate in your funnel. The one thing I'll note is that often people will think about activation in terms of like sign up to activation. But one of the things in which you should, but one of the things that can also help with that is profiling people in flow, like during your onboarding before they've started to go through your activation flow, to know who's in there. That can often send a lot of great signals as to what's working and for whom.
Yeah, we talk a lot about this in the retention and engagement program, which is, and I'll link this to another question, but from I believe it's Karna. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing the name wrong, but asking how do you activate users from, I believe means different segments, like specific flows for, different use cases, different personas, a team, and like all this type of stuff. And I imagine in Amplitude, there's this common use case where you've got the first user that has to set it up, and then you've got the N+1 user where it's already set up and they're already getting into an existing Amplitude instance, maybe with data. And I imagine those flows look like a little different. And depending on the product, like I think commonly you can segment by persona. Sometimes that's like the dominant, definer of like how they might use the product and what their aha moment might be. Sometimes it's not personas. Sometimes it's you have multiple personas and it's more about a use case, right? And the use case is the thing that is actually the thing that dictates and determines how, like what that aha and habit moment might be for them. But I imagine you do this with the analytics product, like a difference between the first user and every subsequential user. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. And again, right, like, I think one of the kind of inherent things there in that question around activation for infrequent product use is that there are certain things that are just harder to adopt. And so sometimes the best way to get people into that is to get them activated on something a little bit easier, and then have, as more users come in or as the company's more set up, because sometimes that can be a blocker too, to then kind of proceed to activate them. So there's certain things that might be a little bit higher up the staircase, either in terms of like difficulty in getting started or awareness that you offer it. So you always want to be thinking about activation. Like we've talked about a lot today in the context of kind of first activation, but there's definitely always a play for kind of subsequent activation, not just for new users that come in that need to be activated, but also in terms of a company who's sort of activated on one product stream or one use case, activating on others.
I would say just two quick comments on this is like, because these are some of the mistakes I see is like, one is you could slice and dice these paths like in almost in an infinite amount of ways, but it just becomes too complex of a software experience to manage. And so I think when we're talking about the slicing and dicing and sending down people different paths, it's really about that 80-20 rule, right? It's really finding those 20% of the use cases that fit like the 80% of the people versus trying to create like a dozen different targeted experience. Maybe this changes with AI and we can have a personal onboarding experience for every individual like that comes in with the right context, but the software like isn't there yet. And so and kind of second to this is I know we have people working on products of all different levels of size and maturity on this. Is if you're finding yourself in the mid phases, like trying to optimize activation by providing a bunch of segmented pathways, it actually probably means you're targeting too many audiences too early. Like you're not narrow enough. Because just like in that early stage of a product, you just you can't do the work to accommodate that many different personas and that many different use cases. It's kind of a setup for failure and just like leads to bad retention. HubSpot infamously went through this early on where they cut their personas and use cases from 4 to 1. I think they were in the tens of millions of ARR at that point when they did that, and to get to better retention, and then like added things back on. And so this stuff, Amplitude's a pretty mature product, and this stuff evolves like over time as well. All right, let's tackle the next one. How did you just like initially prioritize working on activation versus some of the other levers in growth, acquisition, other parts of retention, monetization? Kind of what was your approach there?
Yeah. So there are a couple of reasons that we focus on activation over others. Let me note some of the ones that were hardest to say no to. I think that will highlight this the best, right?
Oh, that's good. I like that.
So one of them was signups. So there was huge opportunity. Our sign up flow, it was actually we were dropping off a bunch of people. There's some like high friction in that sign up experience relative to what we thought we could do. For example, we had people do their org setup as part of that experience, like name their org. And there's even this fun little warning that was like, hey, like, don't screw this up. I mean, I didn't say it quite like that, but basically that's kind of what it implied. It was like, set this and don't forget it or you can't get back in. And it was like very kind of scary and terrifying. And we really didn't need it in there. It was something that we could do just organically. We could just really what we needed to do is give it a name. Like, so users, we really didn't need users to create it there. It was something we could do and then they could adjust it. So I'm just highlighting that because like there were some clear things that were off about that flow and is causing fewer people to get through our signup flow. And we really did want to grow signups, always want to grow signups. But we said no to drastic change there. We did like, we just kind of that copy of it to make it a little bit less scary, but we really didn't make the changes that we knew were going to drive sign up conversion rate. And the reason for that was that when you've got a sub-optimized engine where you're only converting to activation 10% of people, focusing upstream is just putting more people into a really leaky bucket. And so that was one of the reasons that we then turned again more attention activation. And we actually though did pick up the sign up work once activation got higher. So once we got through that launch and we got activation the benchmark, and then at that point had clear momentum into how do we grow this more, we were able to take some team members off of that and put them into other things like sign up to get our sign up conversion rate up and improve the sign up flow, which actually drove another really big tranche of activated users. And that was a recent big win that we had. So saying no to that was a big one. Saying no to making updates ahead of our launch to help with awareness and monetization. So we did way less than we wanted to do or that we felt we could do to improve the experience, help people discover Plus in product and then upgrade from our free plan to Plus. And that was something we did as a fast follow. So we made a lot of cuts there again, so we could just focus on activation. And why, coming back to that slide, we were talking about why is activation so important. If people aren't getting a first value, they're certainly not going to get to second, third value, get them enough value to get over that bar. And so that's why we carefully and ruthlessly prioritize that. But just to fold another question I saw asked that I think is relevant here is how and why did you set that 16%, or how did you know that was good enough? Like why not 15% or 14 or 25 or something else? Part of the reason is what we really wanted to see was that the team had a handle on it and had the levers to pull to move it so that we could drastically move it up. And so going from 10 to 16 represented an over 50% increase from where we were. And that was a big jump in just a few months to make. So it was not just like the number or the threshold, but it was the control that would indicate of the team's ability to move the metric, which then we continued to do after launch. And by prioritizing and saying no to that sign up stuff, saying no to some of the work that we could do monetization and product to drive more Plus awareness, we were able to do that. And then we were able to, with confidence, say, hey, look, yeah, it's going to be a worthwhile investment to invest in sign up conversion because we know that now we've got more of an optimized engine. So it's going to be worthwhile. We're going to get activated users out of that. And we then felt more confident in working on monetization plays because we knew that we'd actually have a critical mass of people who might be interested in paying because they had activated and had value.
You mentioned saying no to things, and so I just want to stick on this theme for a second because Caitlin Ashley asked, when you were Marie Kondoing your starting page, kind of removing stuff, did you get pushback on changing the UI experience? Because this does happen, right, where you have PMs that own different features or different parts of the product, or even sales, right? Like if you have a multi-product company and you start removing stuff, often you get pushback. It's like, hey, like that's my feature, that's my product. You're gonna hurt my metrics, right? Like all that kind of stuff. And so I don't know, did you experience that? And if yes or no, like how would you handle those types of situations?
Yeah, totally. And spot on. Yes, we did have a lot of those discussions. So it's there's multiple ways that you want to address that. First and foremost, like any folks in growth, establish good partnerships and connections with people and other teams. It will behoove you in all kinds of ways. So I'll just give a nod to that, having like open dialogues and discussions with folks is key. The second underlying foundation is having a clear strategy for how you're approaching growth. So everyone kind of knows generally the direction you're going so that when you come to a team like we did, to the CDP team and said, hey, we're going to be, we're moving stuff from the nav and onboarding. And, like one of those is cohorts. And so people probably aren't going to be discovering CDP quite as much. They are open to dialogue. They have a sense of why it's coming. And then that helps with a follow-on discussion, which was in this case that, look, first step is to run the A/B test, and we saw that it increased activation. So we had that data behind us. That's always a good step to run. Just run the test, because obviously, if it fails, you don't want to do all of that kind of rigmarole to get people on board on a specific change. You want them to be on board generally with simplification and your overall strategy and having the partnership and open lines. You want that. But in terms of any specific candy that you're taking away from them, like their product in the nav, you want to wait until you've got the test approved. That's actually going to be a worthwhile move on the metrics. And in this case, right, it was going to them and letting them know, hey, improve the metric. It fits in line with our simplification. And then the third one in this case was just, again, coming back to the user. If it's if it's increasing activation, there's a decent indication it might be the right thing for the user. And in this case, when you naturally unfolded that process, and we certainly always talk to users, people weren't ready to be thinking about their data in a really advanced way right when they were onboarding. They hadn't even bought into using Amplitude at that point. So taking them over to the cohort section, which is really talking about CDP and getting mature data in and out and all these sort of advanced data plays, really didn't fit into the mental model of somebody who was onboarding. And so while it did then take eyeballs away from their product and did harm that part of it, what we found was it really wasn't a good play for the business and the user at that time. The better solution, and this is what we actually invested in with them as partners and as teams, was, hey, once somebody is activated and once somebody's in, and if they're not using cohorts, how do we help them discover some of the first high value ways to use it? And that was a way better approach and fit better with the user's mental model, because they had bought in at that point and might be more interested in getting more advanced data in and out versus trying to shove it into the onboarding flow where they're really not ready. So again, to bring it back, first of all, before you're in a state where you're having to go to someone and give them some bad news about taking away their candy, have a good partnership, have a foundation understanding that simplification is a core part of growth and what you're doing. So they just know that. Run the experiment so you validate it's the right thing, then have that conversation about the how and the why you're going to be removing it.
And with 1 minute left, it's always good to provide context. What was the team that you had working on this? Because sometimes it feels like we do this and it's magical and it's one person and stuff. But I'm interested to check out, what was the team that you had working on this, and how did you form that group?
Yeah. So there were I'd say 2.5 PMs working on this, and I'd say half because in growth there's always people wearing multiple hats. So one person doing kind of data and PM. And then we had a group of around 10 engineers who were doing a blend of kind of systems and platform work. as well as direct growth work. And so they were doing, we had kind of a blend there of people doing like the underlying infra to support things like self-serve, as well as direct things in product. And then we had, we actually started with one designer. We found that we were way underwater on design, especially when we were validating and invalidating. So we quickly added a couple. So that was kind of our ecosystem, right? I'd say we had, I'd say focused, dedicated on that, the kind of the platform and growing it was like a few of our engineers, that part, but then the rest, they were solely focused on activation alongside a PM that was solely focused on activation alongside a designer that was solely focused on activation.
Cool. Well, Laura, I just wanted to say a big thank you for joining us today and kind of sharing this experience. For those of you that want to go really deep on this, check out the Reforge Retention Engagement Program. We go super deep on this. We've got tons of step-by-step how-dos about how to do the analyses, the different research, all the different strategies, just tons of examples and case studies as well. So check that out. I'm also going to try to tackle some of these questions we didn't get to on LinkedIn over the next few days. So if you want to go ahead, follow me, just Brian Balfour on LinkedIn. I'll tag Laura on those as well. And if she has time in her new gig, maybe she can chime in real quick, but I'm sure she's in there onboarding in the first 90 days. Other than that, also thank you to our partners on this, Amplitude, and go check out their product. We're very active users here at Reforge, have been for a long time. And so check that out if you're in the market for product analytics. Laura, thank you again for joining us. And for all of you in the US, enjoy this holiday weekend that's coming up, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, folks.